Case number 052312, the trial of Vinny Del Negro. Vinny Del Negro, aka Vincent Joseph Del Negro, aka Vincent the Black, stands accused of player development negligence, the mismanagement of the team, and failing the strategic duties of an NBA head coach for the 2012 NBA season. For the prosecution, we have Charlie Widows, and for the defense, we have DJ Foster. Prosecution, your opening statements.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense will tell you Vinny Del Negro, amidst extenuating circumstances of a lockout-shortened season, led the team to respectability, to the playoffs, exceeded expectations, and developed players just like he has his whole career. I will tell you, if you look at the evidence and isolate his performance from the noise, you will see that is absolutely not the case. This is the time for action. If you see the evidence that will show throughout the rest of this trial that Del Negro needs to be relieved of his duties and improve, the team will improve and take the next step. That is all for now.
Defense, opening remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution is going to look at the details, and they're going to get caught up in the details. I want you to take a step back and look at this from 40,000 feet, the way we should. The Clippers, prior to Vinny Del Negro, were a laughingstock. They were the worst franchise in professional sports. Vinny Del Negro's job was to come in and make them respectable, have him represent the franchise correctly. And Vinny Del Negro, to his credit, fulfilled and exceeded all of those expectations. His teams always played hard, even when they absolutely had no reason to. In losing seasons, they played hard every single game. He motivated his team. He put them on a rapid track of improvement that no other team did this year. He was a coach players wanted to play for. Caron Butler, Chris Paul, Kenyon Martin, all chose to come to the Clippers, which was unthinkable prior to Vinny Del Negro. And now his contract is up. It's accept or decline. Well, I'll tell you this, Vinny Del Negro never declined any task put in front of him. He accepted every task, and he excelled at it. The prosecution is going to try to point to specific examples where they believe Vinny Del Negro failed us. You can make mountains out of molehills with them, and you can engage in the mudslinging, or you can look at the irrefutable big-picture facts with me. Before Vinny Del Negro took over as coach, the Clippers were losers. And now they're winners, and he turned them into winners. I want you to remember that as we move on to the rest of the trial.
Thank you, counselors. Prosecutor, you have the floor.
The prosecution calls to the stand Mr. Jordan Heimer, expert witness. Mr. Heimer, Derrick Rose, he's a nice player. Would you agree he's a good player?
Derrick Rose is an excellent player.
And Joakim Noah, how about him? Would you say he's a nice player as well?
Joakim Noah is a lovely player.
How about Chris Paul? Is he a nice player?
Chris Paul is quite good at basketball.
Now, to clarify, that is Chris Paul, the third place finisher in MVP voting this year, no?
That's right.
Mr. Harmer, would you agree that if the defense of Vinny Del Negro points to a improvement in wins this year from last year, would you agree that that has a lot to do with the addition of Mr. Paul?
Well, clearly Chris Paul's addition to the team changed the tenor and outlook. He was the best player the Clippers have ever had, and yes, it was a big part of the Clippers' improvement in winning percentage.
Thank you. Now, just take a step back for a minute. What about players such as Chauncey Billups, Kenyon Martin, Reggie Evans? Would you consider those players to have a positive impact on the team?
Yes, more limited players than the ones you listed earlier, but certainly a positive impact on the team.
All right. Now, in terms of the strategy of the team, would you say that anything changed from last year to this year?
Well, the team probably ran more pick and rolls. Obviously, that's plays to Chris Paul's strengths, and they had a lot of Blake Griffin isolations, which were a feature of last year's offense as well.
Anything else?
Anything else in what sense, Counselor?
Would you say that the offense had any more nuance to it?
No, that's pretty much it. High pick and rolls and Blake Griffin isolations. That's the Clippers offense.
I see. We'll come back to this in a second. Mr. Heimer, would you say that Vinny Del Negro came to the Clippers with a reputation for developing players?
Well, Vinny Del Negro, obviously his first job was with the Baby Bulls, as they call them, 41 both seasons. Went down fighting in the first round. And yeah, he had a reputation for being the coach who was there when those young Bulls were rookies, and in the case of Dang's second-year players, and bring them along, whereas he could leave them in a place where they were ready to compete for a championship.
That makes sense. Talking about some of the Clippers' young players, Mr. Heimer, would you say that on the whole, some of their young players improved during his 2 years as coach?
Well, that's a very general question. Could you specify a little bit more?
Sure. Let's talk about individuals here. Would you say that aside from Chris Paul, the biggest investment this offseason was DeAndre Jordan's large contract that they gave him?
That's correct.
And would you say Mr. Jordan improved this year?
I can't say that he did. If you look at his per 36-minute numbers, they're almost identical year over year. In fact, the only thing that changed is a significant drop in his field goal percentage, a few extra minutes, but other than that, basically scoring, rebounding, assisting, almost identical from Vinny's first year to his second.
And now, how about the second most important player on the team, Blake Griffin? Would you point to improvement?
Objection. Leading the witness.
I'm going to overrule that. I'm going to allow it. I want to see where this is going. But, prosecutor, I remind you that you have a short leash here.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Would you say that the point guard Eric Bledsoe, when he returned from injury, did he improve from last year during the regular season?
Well, he wasn't given many minutes during this year's regular season. He, in fact, averaged more minutes as a rookie than he did as a sophomore player.
All right, let's go with that. In the playoffs, would you say he showed improvement?
Certainly. Bledsoe, in fact, maybe was arguably the Clippers' best player in the playoffs, certainly the best player in the second-round sweep against the Spurs, and had the best player efficiency rating of any of the players.
Mr. Heimer, would you please refer to Exhibit A, the minutes played per game in the playoffs of Mr. Bledsoe? Could you read those off, please?
Sure. They were respectively 20, 7, 13, 12, 5, 24, 14, 26, 23, 16, and 23.
That's interesting. You wouldn't call those consistent, would you?
I would not call those consistent.
And now back to, you mentioned that he was the most efficient player that the Clippers had this offseason? Or this postseason?
He was. He had a PER of just above 22.
Okay, I'd like to go to a very important game this postseason. Down 2-0 against the Spurs. The Clippers returned home, and in Game 3 they were up by 24 points at one point. Can you take us through what happened in the third quarter there?
Well, the Spurs went on a 24-0 run, and the game was never in doubt again. During that run, Vinny Del Negro called one timeout. There was one TV timeout. There were two substitutions made, both at the shooting guard position. Once Mo Williams came in for Randy Foye. Then again, Randy Foye replaced Mo Williams. At the end of the third quarter, Vinny told sideline reporter Lisa Salter, "We just needed to score more baskets, had trouble stopping their penetration or getting to the rim ourselves."
So at no point did he insert the best perimeter defender when Tony Parker was carving them up and leading a 24-0 run. Is that what you're saying?
Eric Bledsoe, who I assume is who you're referring to as the best perimeter defender, sat on the bench for 10 minutes in the third quarter.
Now, would you consider that to be a trait of Coach Del Negro, the mismanagement of the rotation?
Well,
Objection. Doing the thing that he can't do. Conjecture, opinion,
Fair enough.
influencing.
Fair enough. I'll finish with this, Mr. Heimer. Would you say that Del Negro excelled or struggled in late game situations or rotations?
I would say Vinny Del Negro is a man of habit. Asked several times during the playoffs if you would consider shaking up a starting lineup that was among the worst lineups of any team in the playoffs. He steadfastly refused. He stuck to the minutes and the rotations that they had been using throughout the second half of the season and was content to see if they won without making adjustments.
Thank you, Mr. Heimer. The prosecution rests.
Defense, cross-examination.
Mr. Heimer, Mr. Heimer, describe Eric Bledsoe's fitness level for me.
Objection, Your Honor. The witness is not qualified to make this judgment.
I will have to say sustained. Mr.
Well-
Heimer has not shown any proclivity towards anatomy or kinesthesiology.
Let me just say this. I was a camp nurse for 2 years, and I know a thing or two about the human body. And while any guess as to Bledsoe's fitness level would be purely speculative, I can tell you that several instances, late in playoff games, he appeared gassed. The national announcers mentioned that he was gassed. Being at the games, you could see hands on knees, and in one instance, he actually had to ask out of the game with just under 3 minutes left. However, it's hard for me to tell you if that is a reflection of a poor fitness level or of Bledsoe's style of play, which is basically hyperactive and all energy all the time.
In your experience as a basketball player, Mr. Heimer, is it easier to play when you are at full energy or you are very tired?
In my experience, it's easier to play when you're at full energy.
I thought so. Okay. Let me ask you another question here. According to Synergy, where did the Clippers rank on sidelines out of bounds plays and points per possession out of timeouts?
Top 20% in the league.
So, as far as strategy goes, would it be fair to say that coming out of timeouts, Vinny Del Negro is a pretty good coach?
I would say you're creating a casual relationship between Vinny Del Negro's coaching and the effectiveness of out-of-bounds plays. One might argue that there are other causes for the Clippers' effective out-of-bounds plays, and one might also argue that there's a lot of noise there. There's a difference between your average out-of-bounds play and one that has to be drawn up as a last play of the game or a last play of the half or quarter, which was someplace this team did indeed seem to struggle.
Okay, fair enough. Let's talk about that offense. You said it was only, let me read my notes here, just high pick and rolls and isolations, is that correct?
The vast majority of it, yes.
Okay, so can you explain to me how the Clippers were the fourth-ranked offense in the league this year in terms of offensive efficiency?
Well, yes, and the explanations have very little to do with coaching. The Clippers were very stingy with the ball, thanks mostly to, obviously, Chris Paul at point. They didn't turn the ball over a lot, and so they got looks almost every time down the floor. And they have some knockdown shooters who were given a decent amount of space by a combination of, obviously, Paul's pick and roll and having to double-team Griffin down low.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the rotations here then. With the rotations, it said it's stuck to the same plan. In your experience, in a lockout shortened season, wouldn't it be smart to stick with a similar rotation so the guys can get used to playing with each other?
Yes, it might be wise, and you're right that we're talking about a season where there was only one or sometimes no practices per week. However, I was specifically referring to an end-of-season playoff situation where there might come a time where the analytics and the numbers have gotten to a place where you can trust them a little bit and have to be comfortable getting outside of your patterns and your habits.
Your Honor, I'm done with this witness. He's very unhelpful. Please get him off the stand.
Okay. Prosecution, do you have any rebuttals?
Your Honor, I stand by what the witness said.
Expert witness.
Yeah, expert.
Then defense, the floor is yours.
Okay. For my witness, I would like to call Mr. Jordan Heimer. Mr. Heimer, I have some interesting questions for you that I want you to answer, and I want you to be completely honest, so help you, Keith Kloss.
I do.
How many coaches start off their careers by getting into the playoffs 3 of their first 4 seasons?
It's not unheard of, but it's rare.
Okay. And did any other playoff team this year have as much roster turnover as the Clippers? I believe they had 6 players in their rotation that weren't on the team last year or didn't play significant minutes. Is that correct?
That is correct, and the Clippers did have the highest ratio of new players.
And did any team improve in terms of record, overall record, as much as the Clippers did this season?
No, Clippers had the biggest year-over-year improvement.
So let me get this straight. He's been to the playoffs 3 out of the first 4 years. He had more players to deal with in a lockout season, and he improved in terms of record more than any other coach. Was that all correct?
That's all correct.
Okay. And in this lockout shortened season, with the new players and the new staff and everything getting used to and bringing in new players as the season went along, how many practices did you think Vinny Del Negro got to hold on average per week?
Very few. I know in the beginning of the season, Del Negro talked about 1 practice per week, and during February and March, I believe they went 6 weeks with a total of 3 practices.
And is it fair that the main indictment on Vinny Del Negro is that he doesn't have much of an offensive or defensive system? Would you say that's correct?
I would say that's correct.
Okay, so answer me this. How is it possible to develop a system when you have maybe 1 practice every 2 weeks and you're bringing in new players all the time?
Well, I would argue that while that's a difficulty, it wasn't a difficulty necessarily unique to Vinny Del Negro and the Clippers. Plenty of teams had turnover this year, and all teams had infrequent practices. Additionally, you can look at, say, Blake Griffin year over year defensively and look at a player that actually seems to have gone backwards. Someone who went from being top 10 in the league in charges taken his first year to someone who dropped completely out of the top 50 this season, which to me may be an indictment of either a system or personal effort.
Mr. Heimer, that's interesting that you want to talk about player development. That really just segues perfectly into what I want to talk about. Because you know who I want to talk about? Mr. Eric Bledsoe. Let's talk about the development of Eric Bledsoe. You rattled off those minutes. If you're going to beat up Blake Griffin for not developing in his second year, why doesn't Vinny Del Negro get some of the credit for Eric Bledsoe's explosive second year?
I'd be
You can't answer that. You can't answer that.
Badgering.
Sustained. Counselor, I remind you that this is your expert witness that you called. Please do not treat him as hostile.
Your Honor, do I answer the question or not?
Mr. Heimer, if you'd be so gracious to answer the question.
I think that reasonable people can agree that those minutes I read earlier, those minutes of Bledsoe's games minutes in the playoff, which included a 5, a 7, and a 9, it's easy to infer from that Vinny Del Negro himself doesn't realize what he developed. Here you have a player who was killing it in the first few games of the playoffs, and then after a few boneheaded plays in the first half of Game 5 of Memphis, he didn't even see the court in the second half. Which I would infer, or what I would infer into that, is that Del Negro himself doesn't trust this player, and that's not something you would say about a player that you would proudly say, I developed. It's either one or the other. You've either developed someone, and you trust them, or they don't play in the second half of a critical playoff game.
Okay, all right. Well, let's move on from the development because, as you said before, the stats don't lie. Eric Bledsoe was the most productive Clipper in the playoffs for the Clippers. And he has only played under Vinny Del Negro, no other coaches. So if you're going to give credit to someone, I think it would be Vinny Del Negro, but I'll move on. Judge, relax. Mr. Heimer, can you tell me, in your expert opinion, if Vinny Del Negro is a better dresser than Greg Popovich?
Again, this is purely speculative. I would say each man has a sartorial style that fits his personality. Vinny has sharp suits, thin lapels, a slim fit. He stayed in shape, and he doesn't mind if you know it. An Italian cut for an Italian-American coach. Popovich, obviously, is a man fully comfortable with himself, knows who he is, and doesn't care who knows it. He wears a shirt open at the collar, a sports coat, a little bit of a schlumpy look, but one that says, I've won 4 championships. What have you done? I like both of them. I guess in the end, I find it hard to give a judgment. They both dress who they are.
So would it be fair to say that Vinny Del Negro looks better than Greg Popovich?
Vinny Del Negro does look better than Greg Popovich, according to kind of a
no. That's all you need to
aesthetic.
say. Excuse me, sir. You are my witness. I may cut you off whenever I would like to. You heard it here first. Mr. Heimer has said that Vinny Del Negro looks better than Greg Popovich. It's hard to disagree. I have another question for you, Mr. Heimer. Can you recite the free throw percentages of the Clippers' front court for me?
Yes, I think I can. Blake Griffin, 52%, Reggie Evans, 50%, Kenyon Martin, 37%, and DeAndre Jordan, 52%.
And would you say that one of the biggest moments of this season for Vinny Del Negro, the pitchfork holders, if you will, was knocking him for the hack of Reggie that Greg Popovich employed during the Spurs playoff series?
That was certainly a moment that caused much chagrin in Clipper Nation, yes.
So let me ask you this. If Neil O'Shea gets all the credit for bringing in Clippers general manager Neil O'Shea, gets all the credit for bringing in Chris Paul, why does he get none of the blame for having a big guy who could shoot free throws?
The witness has no response.
Witness has no response. Okay. I rest my case. The witness is all yours, Mr. Widows.
Mr. Heimer, not too much to add on this topic. I think you acquitted yourself well. One question I guess I would have is, are you aware, Mr. Heimer, that Coach Del Negro had on his bench a big who was actually a very capable free throw shooter?
You're referring to Trey Tompkins, perhaps?
That's right. Mr. Heimer, do you know what percentage Mr. Tompkins shot from the free throw line this year?
I believe in limited time he shot about 70%.
That's right.
Objection. Entirely too small of a sample size.
I would agree with that, Counselor. However, throughout his college career, he also shot 73%. Going back to the developmental question, Mr. Heimer, would you agree that had Mr. Del Negro been a little more open to developing his young players, he may have been more able to employ Trey Tompkins when the going got tough?
I'm not sure what the direct question there is, but I will agree that for a coach that claimed to be a developmental coach, it's hard to both be a developmental coach and a coach who seems only to trust veterans down the stretch of games. Trey Tompkins had trouble finding the floor at all. DeAndre Jordan was rarely on the court in fourth quarters, and this developmental coach chose instead to give those minutes to Kenyon Martin and Reggie Evans, capable guys, but guys with obviously a limited ceiling. Perhaps if Trey Tompkins had more time on the court, he might have been able to give some useful minutes against the Spurs and stretch the floor a bit.
Thank you, Mr. Heimer. And just one last thing, to go back to Counsel Foster's question about Vinny Del Negro's appearance, would you call it presidential?
I would call it gubernatorial.
Fair enough. Would you agree that one primary aspect of a representative's job description would be speaking with the media?
Certainly.
Mr. Heimer, would you have, by any chance, at your disposal, a quote that Coach Del Negro gave after Game 3 to describe the loss after leading by 24 points?
Yes. Del Negro was asked by a reporter, how do you stop the Spurs? And this was his response. They're deep, and that's why they've won so many games. It's very difficult. You help on the corner three-pointer, and you give layups with Tim or Boris making plays. Then they have a bunch of shooters to spread you out, and you have Tony and Ginobili attacking the rim. There are a lot of things that make it hard. End quote.
I'm sorry, did you just say there are a lot of things that make it hard?
Yes, Vinny Del Negro was saying it's difficult to stop the San Antonio Spurs from scoring baskets.
Okay, would you agree that that does not sound like the qualified coach of a playoff contender?
I will agree that that's hardly a coherent response or a strategy for stopping the Spurs from scoring baskets.
Thank you, Mr. Heimer. That's all for the prosecution.
Thank you, prosecution. I would just like to point out to all of our viewers that if you had questions for our expert witness, the prosecution or the defense, that they should tweet us with the @ClipperBlog Live Twitter handle and we'll see if we can get your questions addressed in this courtroom proceedings. Defense, do you have any rebuttals?
This is ridiculous. You're going to let the jury tweet questions because the prosecution is incapable of handling himself in the court of law?
Order! Order! Order, defense! I'll find you in contempt.
You are making a mockery of the judicial proceedings, though.
This is
Defense!
unruly. I can't believe it. Let me rebut. Judge, please, let me do my job. Mr. Heimer, how much money did Charlie Widows pay you? Or did he pay you in rides from Staples Center back to the game?
I actually gave Charlie Widows a ride from Staples Center back after the game. So, in fact, payment went the opposite way.
Okay, fair enough. I have one last question for you about Vinny Del Negro, and I feel as though it's an important one. Would you say the team defense improved as the year went on?
There's no doubt that the team defense did improve as the year went on. In fact, after a 3-game losing streak in mid-March that looked like it might cost Del Negro his job at the time, the Clippers went on a 13-2 run. Over that period, they had the 5th best defensive rating in the entire league, pulling their cumulative defensive rating for the season up into the top 50th percentile, really for the first time all year.
So let's summarize. 4th best offense and offensive efficiency. An improved defense throughout the year, the biggest record jump of any team in the league, and a second-round playoff appearance for a team that hadn't been in 6 years. And this is all on a 2-year deal where the expectations were never to make the playoffs. Would you say that's all accurate?
I would say other than the last part, that is all accurate. I think even with Eric Gordon and Blake Griffin, this team would have expected to make the playoffs this year.
Fair enough. Your Honor, I am done with this clearly corrupt witness.
Thank you, Mr. Heimer. You may step down.
I'd like to call my surprise witness to the stand, Mr. Kevin Arnovitz.
Defense, this is highly unusual, but I'm going to allow it.
Mr. Arnovitz, how are you, sir?
I'm well. I would like to instruct the jury to think of some extraneous issues that are nevertheless extremely relevant to the verdict. First is, irrespective of what the prosecution, defense, and those in the pews, it's not really pews, what is it in the galley? The galley, right? In the courtroom, what is it?
The galley.
Oh, the galley. I would like to instruct those in the galley to consider the following. Irrespective of how they feel about Vinny Del Negro, when you do not renew an existing coach, you must then replace him with a new coach. And one can't just consider Mr. Del Negro in a vacuum, but must also consider who will be replacing him, the value of replacing him. Does that person represent? Are there an upgrade? Are there those out there who seem persuadable to the owner, who is notoriously fickle about his coaching hires? Would that person be someone that Chris Paul could be comfortable with for, well into his hopeful lengthy tenure with the Clippers? And these are considerations that must be made. The option, of course, to the jury is also to decide neither to extend nor renew, but also just pick up 1-year option. I don't know if the defense is arguing for that. However, we'd like to hear from the defense and prosecution, particularly the prosecution, who is advocating for the removal of Mr. Del Negro, who the hell Mr. Prosecution has in mind, and if indeed it's even realistic for the Clippers to consider these folks as candidates. So, Mr. Prosecution, who are you going to pull out of your hat once you remove Mr. Del Negro unceremoniously?
Mr. Arnovitz, this is my courtroom here. I'll do the question asking. But yes, prosecution, I would also like to know the answer to that.
You know what? You might be you might be the protagonist. Harry Thomas, but I'm Richard Mole, and I really kind of run these things.
you're both so wrong. Witnesses and judges don't ask questions. Neither of you is who controls the courtroom proceeding.
Thank you. The one voice of reason. Thank you.
But little do you know, this is actually a kangaroo court.
Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has been very clear that this job is important not only for the success of the team on the court, but keeping the aforementioned Chris Paul and Blake Griffin under contract with the Clippers past this year. We've been very clear that there is a coach who just lost his job in Orlando who would be more than well suited to lead this team to the promised land. Experience working with a big man, experience making a team a real defensive juggernaut, one that I believe would have the respect of the players, a respect that was not always clearly there, as those who were at Staples Center would know if they saw.
Objection. Objection. I am so sorry to cut you off, Mr. Widows. Respect of
That's
the
right.
players?
Respect.
Are we talking about the same Stan Van Gundy that has had his star center basically throw him under the bus in Orlando?
Ladies
His
and
star center
gentlemen,
in Miami throw him under the bus in Miami? How is that respect? Can I ask
Ladies
you?
and
I think
gentlemen, the jury
respect
in Orlando.
is playing hard for your coach, is it not?
Order.
Order,
Mr. Foster,
please.
you'll have your time to speak, Mr. Widows.
In the aforementioned Orlando case, I believe 11/12 of the team came to the support of the coach after the disgruntled star who had been acting very unprofessionally throughout the year continued to act unprofessionally as related to the coach. And in Miami, we may remember that there was clearly a how do we call
Palace intrigue. You know,
there
people
was
were
an
always going to be
agenda.
taking over that job.
There was an agenda in Miami that forced out Coach Van Gundy. I do believe that the Clippers have a superstar that wants to win and a young superstar in the making that would follow suit. And I believe that would be the best option.
Is it my turn to speak now, Judge?
That's right.
Defense. Time
Okay.
for rebuttal.
Rebuttal on that front. Mr. Widows, Mr. Heimer, even you, honorable, dapper, incredibly handsome Judge Hahn, I have a question for you. How many NBA coaches taking over a job with the first team in the first season, new job, first season, have won an NBA title? And I'll give you the answer. You don't have to answer. Once. Once in NBA history has that happened. If you want the Clippers to reach the promised land, historically, the best bet would be go with Vinny Del Negro over a new coach. Phil Jackson has done it. That's it. I don't think there's any Phil Jacksons out there other than Phil Jackson. Now, moving back to your point about Stan Van Gundy, here's a guy who has gotten fired everywhere he has gone. He was fired from Wisconsin. He was fired from Miami. He was fired in Orlando. And why do you think that is? Is it possible that he's too demanding? That he rubs his players the wrong way? I certainly think so. I think maybe he has a problem with, following the rules of an organization. Do we really want that for the Los Angeles Clippers, who still have some skeletons in the closet? Do we want Stan Van Gundy saying, look at my owner, look at him in all his glory? Of course not. What we want is a front man for the organization, someone who will show that, that the Clippers are a respectable franchise, that, they don't make mistakes in the media, and there's no reason to be embarrassed of them. That's Vinny Del Negro. He is the face of this franchise.
Objection, Your Honor. Vinny Del Negro may have been the front of a respectable team, but he himself was the butt of many jokes in the media. He was not respectable. Your Honor, I would refer you to Twitter and other various media outlets where you could constantly see jokes made at the expense of this presidential-looking man.
Overruled. We do not acknowledge the presence of Twitter in my
Thank
courtroom. And
Twitter!
on that topic, I've just been handed a note from Twitter for the defense.
Caleb?
A juror by the name of Kevin Wirt would like to know, defense, why was VDN's staff so weak considering his own inexperience?
Weak? Are we going to call Vinny's assistant coaching staff weak? How about Robert Pack, the same player that Baron Davis once compared Eric Bledsoe to? The same guy who has spent all offseason when he was allowed to. Thank you, Lockout. And practices, and any time he could, mentoring Eric Bledsoe. If you want to hand the development of Eric Bledsoe to anyone, it's Vinny Del Negro's coaching staff and Robert Peck. That black zone, the zone defense that helped the Clippers improve towards the end of the season, Dean Demopoulos, that's his zone. Don't tell me that Vinny Del Negro doesn't have a good coaching staff. He absolutely does. It's ridiculous. Twitter, get out of here. You're the worst.
Prosecution, rebuttal.
Fine, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I would actually have to agree with Counselor Foster on this matter and say this proves my point that Coach Del Negro was not up to the task. He had a fine assistant coaching staff, including Demopoulos, who came up with, as Mr. Foster mentioned, the black zone, which, if you look back on the year, was what keyed many of their defensive turnarounds when they would switch to zone once in a while to overcome their defensive shortcomings. Mark Ivoroni, who has a well-documented past running a point guard heavy system. I believe all those impacts and Mr. Pack with Bledsoe, they actually helped overcome Del Negro, or maybe just mask Del Negro's shortcomings.
Mr. Widows, as you'll soon learn throughout life, you young, innocent child,
Objection!
a coach,
Overruled.
a good coach knows how to delegate tasks to others. And there may not be a better coach at that in the league than Vinny Del Negro. Instead of micromanaging every piece of the organization, he delegates tasks, and he lets Chris Paul run the offense. The 4th ranked, have I mentioned that? The 4th ranked offense in the entire league in his first year with Chris Paul. Vinny Del Negro is a very wise man who understands that, yes, he's not perfect. He may have 1 or 2 limitations, but he's willing to acknowledge those, and that's a big reason why you've seen the Clippers get better every game, every year.
I would ask you this, Counsel Foster. Was delegating part of his responsibility when it was Chauncey Billups leading the huddle or Kenyon Martin? I ask you this, Mr. Heimer. Did you not witness those players leading the huddle and tuning out Coach Del Negro?
There were people who noted the terrible body language of the huddle all the way going back to midseason. To me, the image or the enduring image of bad body language in the huddle that will stay with me is from also Game 3, where Vinny Del Negro called one last timeout with just under a minute to play, down 9 against the Spurs, and frankly the entire team walked right past him. Who was left in the huddle was Mo Williams and Reggie Evans. No one else was even there. I'm not sure that this was a guy who had the full attention and respect of his players in critical situations. Did they believe that he had the play that he was going to draw that would find them the easy basket in the key spot? I'm not sure.
Mr. Heimer, I've just been passed another note via the ClipperBlog comment section where the Blakers would like to know your thoughts on Jerry Sloan as a potential replacement.
First of all, I'd like to know if the Blakers are the same as the Blaker girls, who I follow on Twitter.
Order now.
Sorry, no, it's a diverse fan base. Their question is Jerry Sloan. Should we bring in Jerry Sloan?
Jerry Sloan.
From what I've heard and read, Jerry Sloan is very happy on his farm somewhere in the middle of America and far away from basketball teams. I would also say Jerry Sloan, far more than Stan Van Gundy, actually. Even though Stan Van Gundy has this reputation as kind of this anal retentive nebbish, Sloan is a system guy. He's interested in coming in and running one system that he believes in that works. Whether or not this is a system that would work for the Clippers, especially when you compare the differences between, say, a Malone and a Griffin, before you start plugging in one pick-and-roll combo for another, Blake can't do the things that necessarily made that system work. I could see that really frustrating Blake.
Judge, can I treat the witness as hostile?
Permission granted.
Jordan Heimer, you are just the worst. Jerry Sloan is maybe 90 years old. I'm not sure on that. We'll get someone to verify. I don't understand what the interest is there. Let me ask you this, you stupid buffoon. How many rings does Jerry Sloan have? How many rings does he have, Mr. Heimer? Mr. Heimer, please answer the question. How many rings does Jerry Sloan have?
Jerry Sloan has no rings.
And how many rings does Stan Van Gundy have?
No rings.
And how long have they been coaching? Do you have any idea?
Gary Sloan coached that Jazz team for 20-odd years.
Yes. What president was in office? How much did gas cost the last time Jerry
I believe
Sloan
it was
coaching the Utah
Eisenhower
Jazz?
and 6 cents.
That's correct. And so they've had full careers and chances to reach the mountaintop, and they never have. And we want to quit on Vinny Del Negro after 4 seasons as a head coach, after he just made the Clippers one of the best 8 teams in the league, and got that team to the playoffs with 2 injured stars in games that possibly could have been won if their guys would have been healthy. Am I reading this situation correctly? Am I the only person with a brain in this courtroom?
You're right. You're right. And I hear that this is the summer he draws up all the plays. The plays are a third year innovation. So I'm excited to see what happens. Let's bring it on.
I think I've heard just about enough here. Prosecutor, why don't you give us your closing arguments?
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you have a great opportunity. For the last 2 years, Vinny Del Negro has been charged with leading a team of promising young players and prolific talent to a championship, and he has failed. He has had a defensive player of the year, a first-team player this year, and a bunch of other talent, and yet the Clippers were still 18th in the league in defensive efficiency. Nothing has improved, and the question isn't whether Vinny Del Negro is a capable NBA coach, which he may be. The question is he a capable coach for this team at this time? Chris Paul and Blake Griffin are entering the last years of their contract. The expectations are high. When they signed Chris Paul, Neil O'Shea said, "We've got a big-time chance now to be a major player in the league with the combination of Chris and the rest of the roster." If Chris didn't think that we were close to winning at that high level, believe me, he wouldn't be sitting here right now. Ladies and gentlemen, he may not be sitting here at this point next year if things don't change. You have a great opportunity. I hope you act and decide the right way to do away with Del Negro.
Counsel for the defense, your final thoughts?
Oh, final thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen of the virtual jury, I ask you to consider the timing of this trial that we're having today. Today is May 23rd. Second round basketball is being played as we speak. Mr. Del Negro's contract, however, expires in 8 days, a little bit more than a week. Clippers management and ownership never even expected the Clippers to be in the playoffs at this time when they signed his original coaching contract, let alone a few games away from still being in it. And really, they could still be in it. They had 2 critical injuries that ruined their season. No team could beat the Spurs with their 2 best players hurt. That's unreasonable to hold him accountable for losing a series 4-0 when he was depending on the likes of Nick Young and DeAndre Jordan to battle the systematic Spurs. It's ridiculous. And I have faith that you can see it's ridiculous. Now, I want all these points to illustrate that Mr. Del Negro has quite literally exceeded all expectations put in front of him. Mr. Del Negro, again, is a fine representative of the organization. He says and does all the right things. His team was one of the best in the league this season. You can argue the semantics, the record, the stats, the numbers, they don't lie. Vinny Del Negro is a good coach on a good basketball team. You're smart people. If it quacks like a duck and it acts like a duck and it has beautifully, wonderful, feathered hair like a duck, it's a duck. Del Negro is a great coach that led a great team this season, and he shouldn't be found not guilty of all these outlandish charges placed upon him today. Thank you.
Compelling words, counsel. Please excuse me for a moment. Let us recess while I deliberate.
Tall and tan and
young
and lovely.
The girl from the
Knee
goes
walking.
Deliberation complete. Both sides have presented very compelling arguments here today, and questions do exist regarding Vincent Joseph Del Negro's strategic aptitude. But as the defense has pointed out, championships are rarely won when the head coaching position is in constant flux. And who's to say that Mr. Del Negro doesn't improve along with the Clipper roster? Still, there has been very few improvements in the key players that Mr. Del Negro has had for his tenure as the Clippers head coach. And it's the reluctant decision of this court, empowered by ClipperBlog, to find the defendant, Vincent Joseph Del Negro, guilty of all charges. The court would like to thank the prosecution and the defense for their time. They would like to thank Mr. Jordanheimer for his expert witness testimony, and would like to thank the jurors watching this at home. Thanks to all. We will see you soon.